Hello, I'm Dr. Ian Kenvin from the Avexia Foundation, and this is the third in a series of workshops that we are calling Riding the Corona Coaster. And today we're going to be looking at the idea of projection and transference. So without further ado, I'll share screen and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Okay, so as I say, this is an online workshop, third of three, and we're looking at the idea of projection and transference. The workshops have been looking at the ups and downs of living through a pandemic, and in particular today we're going to be understanding projection and transference, which can be shortened to why people can be so nasty sometimes. Okay, this will take about 20 minutes. The project is made possible by the support of the National Lottery Community Fund. Okay, so this is the structure of what we're going to look at. We're going to start off by looking at some definitions and trying to understand the concepts a little bit, particularly why these are important for ourselves and also to help us to begin to understand the behavior of others. And key to a lot of this is looking at the effect of stress. So we're going to look at a concept that we have looked at in previous workshops, the idea of the stress container. We'll then use these ideas to as a tool to monitor our own behavior and maybe striving toward what I'm calling self-compassion, which really links into the idea of practical actions, and then we'll conclude with some practical resources for you. Okay, so these two concepts, projection and transference, really it can be summarized as the phenomena that happens when we transfer your ideas, our personal ideas and views, and we project them onto someone or something else. So what is it? Well, it's essentially a defense mechanism where an individual will deny the existence of qualities or impulses within themselves, both positive and negative, although more often than not these are negative. And what one does is to project or attribute those characteristics, those qualities, those impulses onto others. So in this way, undesirable feelings or emotions can be offloaded or exported or projected onto someone or something else, rather than admitting to or dealing with those unwanted feelings within oneself. It's quite easy to see it in others, and we've seen it quite a lot in terms of the issues around moral panics, which we have seen a great deal of in the past year or so. The idea that people resort to ranting indignation. Some interesting work has also been done in terms of projection and transference in understanding things like road rage. And I suppose the contemporary version of that would be, proximity provocation, where we feel that somebody is coming too close to us in time of pandemic. We also get this issue where you get the self-appointed warrior, usually a keyboard warrior, often using the anonymity to engage in what we broadly call trolling. But equally, we've got people that feel that they are they can preach from the moral high ground because that's the place that they belong. Also, we can see some of these ideas around projection and transference when we think about things like domestic violence. We also see it in racism, both conscious and unconscious, sexism, etc., sort of psychonormative, heteronormative. It's quite a long list. So it's quite easy to see these things in others. It's rather more uncomfortable to try and recognize those qualities within oneself. But the problem here is, or the issue here is, we all do it. It's one of these things one doesn't like to think about too much, but we all do this. So, and really it's very simply explained as a self-defense mechanism, and it's a self-defense mechanism in response to stress. So we first start getting talk of this idea, and it's not a new idea by any stretch of the imagination. We first find it in 1898, in the late 19th century, by some of the earlier writings from the father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud. And he, in his work, identified that this idea of projection and transference is essentially, or it is usually, the externalization of an individual's negative traits. And that list could be extensive, but in essence, it's about placing the blame on an outside force, such as other people or the government or the environment or society or basically other people, rather than actually realizing that some of these negative things are within ourselves. And I think it's particularly helpful at this point to think about how this relates to the idea of the stress container model, which I've presented in earlier talks. There's a link there to show where you can find them, but actually this is the stress container model, which you may be familiar if you've attended any of these other workshops. The idea really is a way of concept to look at how we deal with stress. And if we think of each individual as having an individual stress container, now some stress containers might be quite large, others might be relatively small, but basically think about the stress container as being that into that which flows stressors, the things that cause us stress. And eventually, if things keep flowing into any container, it will fill up to the brim full, then it will spill or overflow. And that spilling or overflowing is often where we get that kind of emotional flare or emotional outburst, anger outburst. It's an interesting model to understand why sometimes it's the final smallest drop that finally fills the container that makes it topple over or overflow, and we flare in some way. Obviously, when we look at this in more detail in other workshops, we also talk about the importance and effectiveness of having good coping mechanisms and here it's in the symbolic form of a tap on the side of the container. And of course, if our coping mechanisms open the tap wide enough, and so long as the outflow on our coping mechanisms is greater than the inflow of our stressors, we won't have that toppling over. We won't have our stress container overflowing. But that's almost a subject for another session. So if you're interested, go and look further on our website, and there's a lot more detail on that. Okay, so one of the things that I really want to try and do within these workshops is to provoke you to think. So if you're watching this, what I'd like you to do in a moment is to have a look at these 4 questions that I've put in front of you here, and then press the pause button. So pause, think, honestly reflect. So what I'd like you to be thinking about is, it seems to be relatively easy to see projection and transference in others. It's less comfortable to recognize those behaviors within ourselves. So have a reflect on that. I'd also like you to think about, does just the very thinking about that above point make you feel uncomfortable or even defensive? Can you be sure that those feelings, that first level of feeling that you get when you read that question, are your feelings genuine? Or could your mind actually be putting up a defensive smoke screen to shield you from self-awareness? We're in a situation where the background mood music of society is filled with unresolved stress. Could it be that your flare of emotion can be explained by you unconsciously projecting your own negativity onto someone or something else? fourth question really is, might your mind actually be running a PR exercise that is designed to diffuse or deflect or excuse your need to find blame or fault in others rather than recognizing it within yourself? So I'd like you to pause, have a think about that, and then we will start in a moment. Welcome back. I hope you found that interesting. Okay, so let's have a look a bit more, unpack a little bit more around this idea of motives. It seems to be, in the human condition that we need to find in our desire to understand things, we seem to need to allocate blame. We seem to be looking for a perpetrator, the person X, if you like, the thing that started it all. And it's also, I think, driven by the mind's need to find a simple explanation in a situation which is actually much more defined by complexity than simplicity. But because many of us, in order to make sense of things, we want to try and find a nice, neat, simple explanation. And actually, what we're doing, what we can see there, is it's our mind trying to make sense of what is actually an extremely complex situation. Because if we feel we can understand things, it gives us a semblance of control. It gives us at least the feeling that we have some control if we know what the issue is. And it also enables us to supposedly rationalize the essentially irrational fear of the other. Anything that's other, anything that's not us, is feared. And one of the things which this idea of projection and transference can do is to effectively, through a kind of process of almost of smoke and mirrors, we rationalize these thoughts to make them make sense for us, when actually, if we really sit back and really apply our rational minds, begin to realize, actually, no, the other is not automatically a threat to us. And also within this, I think we need to acknowledge the power of the norm. I mentioned it earlier, but the idea that these are norms by which people behave. So it might be the norms in terms of the way in which society runs itself, the norms in the way in which we have relationships with other human beings, the norms of the way in which we gain employment. Yeah, it's a long, quite extensive list. But really, the idea of this projection and transference does seem to link into, when we try and understand motivations and our motives for projecting and transferring, there is this idea of the fear of the other and the power of normative thinking. Okay, so what I'm suggesting here is that we can begin to divide this down and think about this in a slightly different way. If you think about there being two major ways in which people broadly seem to behave, you will have people who will inherently move towards the passive. Others, almost in their nature, tend to be more aggressive. In terms of a response to a situation, some people may be indifferent, whereas others might feel a high level of individual investment in what's going on. Some people revert to the idea of hopelessness and helplessness, whereas other people are much more characterized by an action mindset or even an explosive mindset. Some people may be essentially exploitable and weak in that context, or the other end of that extreme being kind of uncontrolled and frankly dangerous. And that simple this or that is way too simple, way too simplistic. And what I'd like to suggest is, well, how about, in terms of a practical way of thinking about projection and transference. What about trying to find a third way? And within the third way, what I'm suggesting we think about is trying to develop this idea of a compassionate curiosity. And that's an important idea. So the idea of curiosity, so we want to try and understand, but we're not trying to make what we're looking at fit our preconceptions. The idea is actually, well, let's see these things actually as they are and have a level of compassion within that. Now that's compassion for oneself, but also compassion for the way in which other people are behaving. Because when we begin to understand the motives and the triggers for the way in which other people behave, it might enable us to have a more third way or compassionate view of those behaviors. So it's not easy, and it does require quite a high level of inner strength and the idea of really engaging our rational mind. I think that's quite important, because the idea is that if we can strive for self-awareness, so that's being aware of ourselves. Now that's easy to say and it's much harder to do. A lot of people have warm words about, yeah, I'm very self-aware, but are we really? Or is it, once again, the mind just doing smoke and mirrors, just doing a PR job to try and justify our behaviors? So, it's quite important to think about, okay, when was the last time you challenged yourself? Examine your own motivations and preconceptions. Again, you might feel defensive about that. You might feel, no, I don't need to do that because I know I'm right. Well, are you? Because, you need to think, is that just your mind telling you that because that's more comfortable? That's the easy way. It's not the third way. So compassionate curiosity is, without beating yourself up, can you examine your emotions and responses to the world around you? And can you get a sense of, is there balance and objectivity in that view? So, in summary, I think that if we think about this idea of projection and transference as a way of understanding why people behave, particularly in times of great stress, why people behave in the way that they are, it can help us to understand the actions of others. It may also help us to understand or acknowledge our own actions, because projection and transference isn't something that only other people do. We all do it. So it's worth having a think about, well, can we understand and acknowledge our own actions? And I think that constantly what we need to see here is that all of this needs to be seen in the context of high levels of background stress. If you like, the mood music behind the way in which we're living our lives at the moment is very stressful. And occasionally that stress will find a peg to hang itself on, will find something that it's going to focus on, but that may not be rational. So, as I've said, the idea of projection and transference has been around for a long time, and it's one which is, I think, quite useful to us. If we can actually think about that process, what can be very helpful is that if we can understand and compassionately view projection and transference in ourselves and others, we can do what I've called in another workshop, tame your monkey mind. Your monkey mind is a conceptual model which enables us to think about our limbic or primitive mind. I talk about much more in another workshop. So have a look on our website. You'll find a whole section on taming your inner monkey, or taming your monkey mind. But in a very simple way, what the monkey mind represents is your primitive, your limbic mind, your initial fight or flight, initial anxiety response. And if you can tame that monkey, you can have a more rational response. So rather than flaring, rather than reacting, you can actually say, okay, I can feel myself becoming more caught up in this, and that you can have a more rational response and say, okay, I need to find some way to cool off. I need to find some way of diffusing the anxiety, calming the monkey, giving the monkey some of what it needs, so it calms down and allows you to then deal with things in a more compassionate and rational way. Because, as I say, the third way is rational, is compassionate self-awareness. Okay, so as I've said, there's more information on this. If you have a look on our website, which is www.avexiaorg.co, avexiaorg.uk. The first two, there's the understanding stress and anxiety, which will help us to understand that flaring process, and taming your monkey mind, which I've just talked about before. More generally, I think there are some really interesting resources out there which can help us to self-educate and to better find that third way, and to not be constantly prone to the siren call of projection and transference. So there's a link there for Mind, and their tips for everyday living, I think, are extremely relevant at all times, but particularly now in times of pandemic. I'd also point you to have a look at the NHS website. Again, some very, very good information there. And I've given you the link there that looks at stress and anxiety and depression. In particular, I've been talking around this idea of anxiety and understanding that anxiety response today. And finally, plug there for Action for Happiness, a really interesting organization that are doing some really good work, and can be very helpful when we're trying to have a less catastrophic view of the world, and to realize that actually happiness might be the most important lifeline that we can have in times of stress, and particularly in times of pandemic. So that has been understanding anxiety, that has been understanding projection and transference. I've been Dr. Ian Kenvin from the Avexia Foundation, and I thank you very much.